The scream tore through the midday heat like a bullet, sharp and merciless, and the crowd turned as if hungry for blood. Dust hung heavy in the narrow alley between the feed store and the stable, where whispers buzzed like flies circling rot. Clara sat trapped on a rough wooden stool, her hands shaking, her face smeared black as though someone had dragged her through soot. Her auburn hair, once the only softness left in her life, was being hacked away in fistfuls. Each lock hit the ground with a dull thud, swallowed by dirt that already reeked of sweat and cruelty. The woman holding the shears, her mother-in-law, stood broad and cold as iron, her jaw clenched like a blade about to strike. Every word she spit into Clara's face was venom meant to stick. Lazy, worthless, shameful. Her voice cut through the air louder than the scissors, loud enough for the bystanders to feast on the humiliation. Men lingered at the edges, pretending they weren't part of it, but their smirks betrayed them. Women pulled their shawls tighter, whispering as if the scene were a spectacle bought and paid for. Clara's eyes fixed on the dirt at her feet, refusing to rise. Looking up would only invite more cruelty, more eyes willing her to break. Her body trembled with the weight of every insult, every snip of the blade that stole another piece of her dignity. The grip on her arm from her brother-in-law tightened, bruising her flesh, holding her in place like a criminal condemned without trial. The air thickened, electric, as if the town itself held its breath. Everyone was waiting for her to cry out, to crumble, to surrender. But what fell instead was silence, terrifying, suffocating silence, punctured only by the relentless rasp of the shears. And beneath that silence was a truth that tasted like ash. This wasn't punishment. This was erasure. They weren't just cutting her hair. They were cutting away her place, her worth, her humanity, piece by piece, under the scorching eye of the town. The last lock of Clara's hair hit the dirt, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still. The only sound was the rasp of the shears closing one final time, followed by a cruel laugh from the crowd. The shame hung heavy, choking the air, pressing her down deeper into the stool. Clara's chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, as if even the act of breathing had become dangerous. And then, boots scraped against grit. A single set. Slow. Steady. Deliberate. The crowd shifted. Men stepped aside uneasily, women pulled back as a shadow stretched long across the stool where Clara sat. A tall figure cut through the dust and the muttering voices, his wide-brimmed hat tilted low, his stride unhurried but unyielding. Eli Mercer. The loner rancher who had lived outside town for years, spoken to few, trusted by even fewer. His presence was not loud, not showy, but it was undeniable. His eyes, cold and steady, locked not on the mother-in-law clutching the shears, not on the brother-in-law gripping Clara's arm, but on Clara herself. She flinched under the weight of that gaze, not because it was cruel, but because it was the first look all day that didn't want to break her. "She's coming with me." His voice was low, calm, yet it carried like thunder rolling over distant hills. A ripple went through the crowd. Some laughed nervously, unsure whether to mock him or fear him. The brother-in-law's hand shifted toward the butt of his revolver. The mother-in-law's eyes narrowed, her voice dripping with venom. "She belongs to us. By law. She married my boy, she's ours." Eli didn't blink. He stepped closer, boots grinding against the earth until he stood just inches away. One hand came to rest on the man's shoulder, firm, heavy, the weight of someone who had moved cattle heavier and meaner than this bully. "Not anymore," he said. Clara's breath caught. For the first time, her head lifted. Her eyes, haunted, rimmed red, met Eli's. There was disbelief there, but also a flicker of something dangerously alive. Hope. The crowd quieted, the tension snapping like a wire pulled too tight. The mother-in-law, furious, hurled the shears into a bucket with a clang. "You'll regret this, rancher." Maybe he would, but Eli wasn't asking permission. He pulled his neckerchief loose, the fabric worn soft by years in the sun, and draped it over Clara's shoulders, covering the torn seam at her collar. It was a small gesture, yet it cut through the humiliation like a clean wind. A hush fell over the alley. "Stand up," Eli told her. His words weren't a demand. They were a hand extended in the only language she still trusted, plain and steady. For a long, painful heartbeat, Clara didn't move. Then slowly, with trembling knees, she rose. The brother-in-law's grip faltered, and Eli's stare bored into him until he stepped back, uncertain. Clara swayed as though she might collapse, but Eli's hand hovered near her elbow, close enough to catch her, far enough not to cage her. Together, they walked through the crowd. Whispers followed like snakes in the dust. Names, curses, predictions of blood to come. But no one stepped forward. Eli's presence was iron, and the revolver at his hip glinted in the harsh sun like a silent promise. At the hitching post, his gelding stamped, restless, sensing the storm in the air. Clara froze, the saddle looming like a wall too high to climb. Her body stiffened, caught between terror and exhaustion. Eli didn't ask, didn't lecture. With one swift, effortless motion, he lifted her into the saddle, his arm steady and sure. She gasped, startled. But before fear could take root again, he swung up behind her, one hand on the reins, the other braced close enough to steady her trembling frame. The crowd parted as the horse began to move, hooves striking the ground in a rhythm that cut through the silence. Dust rose behind them. Not once did Eli look back. Not once did he need to. The weight of 100 eyes burned into their backs until the bend in the road swallowed them whole. But even as the town faded into the distance, the danger didn't. Clara sat rigid, every muscle taut, her breath shallow. She knew, just as Eli did, that this wasn't over. Her in-laws wouldn't let her go so easily. Not after being shamed in front of the whole town. Somewhere on that horizon, across the wide, unforgiving land, retribution was already taking shape. And yet, in that moment, with the wind tugging at the uneven ends of her hair and the neckerchief still warm on her shoulders, Clara felt something she hadn't known in years. The faint, fragile outline of freedom. And that, folks, is just the beginning. One rancher defying an entire family's cruelty. One woman standing on the edge of despair, pulled back by a stranger's quiet strength. But what happens when the in-laws come hunting? What happens when law and blood feud collide on the open plains? If this story gripped you, if your heart raced when Eli said, "She's coming with me," don't stop here. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends so more people can ride with us into the next chapter of this Wild West tale. Because the storm is only just gathering, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The road out of town unspooled behind them in a trail of dust, but Clara's shoulders stayed rigid, her body wound tight as barbed wire. Each hoofbeat carried them farther from the jeering crowd, yet the echoes of laughter, of her mother-in-law's venom, seemed to ride the wind at their backs. She clutched Eli's neckerchief with both hands as if it were the only rope keeping her from sinking back into the pit they had dug for her. Eli didn't speak. He never needed many words. His silence wasn't cruel. It was steady, deliberate, the kind that allowed the land to speak for him. But Clara could feel the way his body tensed each time the horizon shifted, the way his eyes scanned the ridgelines as though expecting riders to appear at any moment. By the time the town was nothing more than a smudge of dust in the distance, the sun had begun to tilt west. Long shadows crept across the sage, painting the land in strips of gold and black. When the cabin finally came into view, small, weathered, its roof slanting like a man bowed by years of work, Clara's chest loosened slightly, though the knot of fear never truly let go. Eli swung down first, his boots striking the porch boards with a hollow thud. He reached up to lift her from the saddle. She stiffened instinctively, a flinch born of too many rough hands, but this one was different. Firm, yes, but careful. He set her on her feet as if she might break. "Sit," he said simply, nodding toward the bench by the door. Then he disappeared into the shadows of the cabin. Clara sat, her body still trembling, her eyes roaming over the yard. A chicken coop stood neatly by the sidewall, a pile of split wood stacked with the precision of habit. The air smelled of juniper smoke and the faint tang of rain far off. She had never known a place so quiet. The silence itself felt fragile, as if the first raised voice might shatter it. When Eli returned, he carried a tin basin brimming with water. He crouched, poured it in carefully until it lapped at the rim, and set a rag beside it. For your face. Her fingers trembled as she dipped the cloth, squeezing it out before lifting it to her skin. Black streaks of soot and humiliation ran down her cheeks, swirling into the basin. She worked in silence, half afraid the stains would never truly wash away. When she glanced at him, almost asking with her eyes whether she'd missed a spot, Eli only shook his head once. No judgment. No pity. Just truth. Inside, the cabin was dim but tidy. A worn table with 2 chairs, a small stove with an iron kettle, a quilt laid across a narrow bed. It wasn't wealth, but it was order, something her life had not known in years. She hovered in the doorway, unwilling to step too far, unwilling to believe any of it was real. That night, Eli laid a plate of beans and cornbread in front of her. The food was plain, but to Clara it tasted like a memory she'd thought long buried. She murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and he took it as enough. When the dishes were cleared, he unrolled a bedroll near the hearth. "You take the room. Door stays open, just in case." She hesitated in the doorway, glancing back. He sat by the firelight, methodically checking the rifle propped against the wall. His movements were quiet, deliberate, as though he were already preparing for a threat neither of them dared name. She left the door open a crack, the lamplight spilling through the darkness like a lifeline. Sleep did not come easily. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, carrying with it phantom echoes of hooves. Once she swore she heard a horse snort beyond the fence, but when she looked through the gap in the door, Eli was still on the floor, his breath even, his hand resting loosely near the rifle. At dawn, Clara stepped onto the porch. The cold air stung her lungs, but it was clean, not tainted with dust and voices that wanted her broken. Eli was at the pump, sleeves rolled high, filling buckets with water. He didn't look surprised to see her, just nodded toward the bench as though her presence was expected. Through the day, she moved carefully around the cabin. She swept the porch, washed the basin, set the tin cups to dry on a clean towel. Eli said nothing, but she caught him glancing once toward the kitchen, his expression unreadable. Later, she watched him mend a section of fence in the waning light, his shoulders shifting beneath the weight of the post. He worked without waste, without hurry, as though time itself bent to his rhythm. That evening, as dusk gathered, he slid a small jar across the table toward her. "For the scratches," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, then opened it. Pine resin rose sharp and clean. She touched it to the raw skin on her cheek, her breath catching at the sting. For the first time since town, her eyes lifted to meet his, and held. But safety was an illusion too delicate to trust. Clara could feel it in the way Eli's gaze lingered toward the road, in the way he moved the lamp from the window so its glow wouldn't be seen from afar. He never said the words, but she knew. Her in-laws would come. They wouldn't forgive humiliation. They wouldn't forgive being defied in front of the town. That night, she left her door wider open than before. Outside, the windmill creaked in the dark, and somewhere far off a coyote called. She lay awake, not from fear alone, but from the heavy awareness that she was no longer waiting to be broken. She was waiting for the storm she knew was already gathering. The days at Eli's cabin began to find their fragile rhythm, but beneath every quiet moment the threat hung like storm clouds just out of sight. Clara swept the porch twice a day, her hands steady, though her eyes never stopped flicking toward the distant road. Eli worked with the calm of a man used to hardship, yet his gaze lingered longer on the horizon, his rifle never far from reach. It started with a sound, distant, low, steady, hoofbeats. Clara froze mid-step in the garden, her hands buried in the soil. The rhythm carried on the wind, too heavy for cattle, too measured for chance travelers. She turned her head sharply toward the ridge. The thump faded into silence, but the knot in her chest told her it hadn't been her imagination. "You hear it too." Eli's voice came from the porch, level, certain. He wasn't asking. That night, the air carried the metallic scent of rain. Eli stacked more wood by the porch, checked the rifle, and sat long into the darkness, listening. Clara lay awake with the door open wide, staring at the shadows that shifted across the floorboards. Every creak of the windmill, every distant snap of a branch, felt like a prelude to violence. By morning, the storm arrived. Not with lightning first, but with riders. Eli stepped outside just as four figures appeared on the ridge. The sky behind them boiled black with rain clouds, their silhouettes sharp against the bruised horizon. Hooves churned wet earth as they drew closer, slow and deliberate. Behind them rattled a wagon, its canvas flaps pulled back to reveal the iron stare of Clara's mother-in-law. Clara stepped into the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized them instantly, her husband's brothers, broad and narrow, cruel in equal measure. And the neighbor, the one who had always stood too close at the mercantile, eyes crawling where they didn't belong. They hadn't come to talk. They'd come to reclaim her like livestock. The horses stamped just beyond the fence. The storm wind whipped skirts and coats, rattling wood, filling the air with the smell of rain and iron. The mother-in-law rose in the wagon bed, her voice cutting through the storm like a whip. "You've got something of mine." Eli's reply was steady, unshaken. "She's not yours, not property, not cattle to be traded." A cruel laugh broke from the broad brother. "Law's on our side. Widow belongs with her husband's blood." "You want law?" Eli's jaw flexed. "Go to the sheriff, but if you cross this fence, you'll answer to me." The narrow brother's hand slid across the butt of his revolver. The neighbor leaned close, muttering words Clara couldn't hear over the storm. Her knuckles whitened on the doorframe. She had run once. She would not run again. "No," she said suddenly, her voice carrying clear through the downpour. It was the first word she had spoken since they arrived, and it rang sharper than gunfire. The mother-in-law's head snapped toward her, eyes blazing. "You know where you belong, Clara. Come down now." Clara's hair, still uneven, whipped across her face in the wind. Her voice was quiet but unyielding. "Not with you." The broad brother swung from his saddle, boots splashing in the mud. "You gonna shoot me in front of my own ma?" he sneered, stepping toward the fence. Eli lifted the rifle into his hands. The barrel angled toward the ground, but his voice was iron. "If you cross, I'll do what's needed." The storm pressed closer, rain driving sideways across the yard. The broad brother hesitated, his eyes flicking to the others, uncertain. Tension coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break her ribs. And then, a new rider appeared. From the far side of the road, a lean man on a bay mare, his coat flapping open to reveal the badge pinned at his chest. The sheriff. Two deputies followed close, rifles slung across their saddles. "I heard trouble was brewing," the sheriff said, voice calm, but his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Thought I'd see for myself." The mother-in-law shifted her tone, suddenly sweet as poison. "Family matters, Sheriff. Just here to take back what's ours." "A widow's her own person," the sheriff said flatly. "Ain't livestock. You've got no claim." "She's stolen from us," the narrow brother spat. "Got proof?" the sheriff asked. Silence followed, heavy as the storm. The rain came harder now, drumming against canvas, rattling the boards of the porch. The sheriff's voice cut through it. "Then I suggest you ride home. Cross onto his land, it's trespass, and I'll see you in irons." For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The broad brother's chest heaved, the narrow one twitched near his gun. But the sheriff didn't flinch, and Eli didn't lower his rifle. Finally, the mother-in-law spat into the mud, fury burning in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Maybe not," Eli said quietly. "But it's over for today." One by one, the riders turned. The wagon creaked back toward the ridge, swallowed slowly by rain and distance. The sheriff lingered until their shapes disappeared, then tipped his hat and rode the other way, deputies at his side. Eli remained at the fence, rain plastering his shirt to his back, rifle still in hand. Behind him, Clara gripped the doorway, her nails digging into the wood. The yard was empty again, but her chest heaved with the weight of what had just passed. She wanted to believe she was safe, but the echo of hooves lived on in her ears, a shadow that would not be washed away by rain. The rain did not stop for 2 days. It fell in steady sheets, drumming against the roof, running in silver rivers down the yard until the earth itself seemed to sag beneath its weight. Inside the cabin, time slowed to a hush. Clara moved quietly between hearth and table, her presence light but constant, while Eli worked with a methodical calm, checking the rifle, chopping wood, tending to cattle in the downpour as if nothing, not even the fury of her in-laws, could bend him. Yet beneath the silence lived a tension neither dared speak. Clara would catch him staring out the window at the empty road, his jaw set like a man waiting for the next blow. She too listened, night after night, for hoofbeats that might return with vengeance. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. But when the sun finally broke through, scattering the clouds and laying gold across the hills, Clara felt something shift. The threat had not vanished, but the weight of fear no longer pressed her down the way it once had. That morning, Eli stood by the pasture fence, a tin cup of coffee steaming in his hands. Clara joined him, her boots damp from the grass, her hair, though still uneven, catching the light like copper flame. For the first time, she did not lower her eyes when he looked at her. She met his gaze, steady, unflinching. It was not the gaze of a broken woman anymore. Days lengthened into weeks. Clara planted beans in the garden, tucked squash seeds into the dark soil, her fingers working with a care that felt almost like prayer. Eli mended the roof before the summer storms, his broad frame outlined against the sky as she watched from below. Slowly, the cabin ceased to feel like a refuge borrowed from a stranger and began to feel like something else, a home. But shadows still haunted the edges. Now and then, Clara would pause mid-task, her head turning toward the ridge, heart pounding with the memory of riders silhouetted against the storm. Eli never dismissed it. He'd simply nod, as though to say he felt it too. In that unspoken understanding grew a bond deeper than words. One evening, as fireflies rose above the pasture, Eli disappeared inside and returned with a small wooden box. He set it on the railing between them and opened the lid. Inside lay a silver hair comb, engraved with vines and blossoms. "For when it's long again," he said. Clara's throat tightened. Her fingers brushed the cool metal, and for a moment she could not speak. It was not a trinket. It was a promise. That her dignity, her beauty, her very self would grow back, no matter what had been stolen. She wore it for the first time weeks later, when her hair had softened into waves that could finally be tucked. Spring gave way to summer. Clara learned to ride Eli's gelding, her skirts gathered, her laughter startling even herself when the horse splashed into the creek without warning. Eli's patience steadied her, teaching her to guide with her knees, to trust the land beneath her. By August, the garden was bursting, beans climbing high, squash heavy on the vines. Clara's arms had grown strong, her skin bronzed by the sun. It was on a crisp autumn evening, with cottonwoods dropping gold leaves into the creek, that Eli finally spoke the words that had lingered in silence too long. He asked her to walk with him down to the bend in the river, where he had first brought her horse to drink. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, the sky glowing with the last light of day. "I figure you've had enough taken from you," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "I'd like to give you something that can't be taken. My name." For a heartbeat, the world was still. Then Clara smiled, small but sure. "Yes." 2 days later, they stood beneath the cottonwoods, with only the creek and the wind as witness. A traveling preacher read the vows, his voice blending with the rustle of leaves. Clara wore the flannel shirt beneath her dress, the silver comb glinting in her hair. Eli looked at her as if she were the first sunrise he had ever seen. From that day on, the cabin was no longer just a shelter against storms. It was a place where laughter began to return, where hands brushed in narrow doorways and did not pull away, where silence was no longer heavy but full. The scars remained, hers and his, but they no longer defined them. They were only part of a larger story, a story still being written on the wide, unforgiving land, one day at a time, side by side. Yet even in peace, tension lingered at the edges. Clara knew the world outside could be cruel, and whispers of vengeance might someday return. But when she leaned against Eli's shoulder at dusk, the horizon glowing with embers, she felt no fear. Whatever storm might come, she no longer faced it alone. "And now I want to hear from you. Did Clara's defiance give you chills? Did Eli's quiet strength move you the way it moved her? Or was it the simple silver comb, a promise that dignity can grow back, that stayed with you most? If this tale struck a chord, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with others who believe in justice, resilience, and the wild spirit of the frontier. Because out here in the Wild West, every story isn't just survival. It's a fight to reclaim what makes us human.